And one of the things that really caught my eyes when I was looking at your journey is this report that you mentioned at the beginning of your conversation. And the report, I want to make sure I get it correct. It is called The Discriminatory Policing in Hawaii Schools. Reliance on police in Hawaii schools is excessive, discriminatory, and violates national juvenile justice policies. It was released March 24, 2021, and the authors are Omar Bird, Noreen Cole, Natalie Rita, Nandita Sharma, all of the UH Manoa, which are part of the UH Manoa Department of Sociology, along with yourself. And that report had so much data in it. And we're definitely going to post this up with our episode so that our readers can really dig into the numbers. But would you like to give our readers a summary of what that report and its findings concluded?
Yes. So what that was looking at is this report is the first of its kind in terms of the data that was collected. So right now, when we talk about education discipline data, most people have to rely on what the school district has self-reported to the federal government. So there's something called the U.S. Office for Civil Rights. It's in the U.S. Department of Education. And they require a survey that every school district fill out and report every other year. It's called the Civil Rights Data Collection, or CRDC. And in that data collection, it's a huge, huge data collection. There's stuff related to student achievement, but this report specifically looks at school-based arrests. So that can come into place with a couple indicators, including rates of referrals to law enforcement. So not every school in Hawaii has police on campuses. It's my understanding that there are SROs in the other counties, but not on Oahu. And so when a student is arrested at school, a police officer typically needs to be called to the school. So that can be typically is an administrator, right? It's usually not a teacher calling from their classroom. The teacher will send the kid to the office, not even intending for the police to be called, but something, happened, and you send them out. I used to send kids and just like, wait in the hallway for me. And sometimes you're like, no, I'm not going. And I'm like, what do I do? 17-year-old refusing to get out of their seat. But so rates of referral to law enforcement is a metric that looks at when an adult, an administrator within the school is calling the police to come arrest a child. The thing is that we know that the DOE data here has been notoriously spotty, at least over the past decade, if not longer. So what's new about this report is that we actually went to HPD, the Honolulu Police Department, so the police department in charge of the city and county of Honolulu, that covers all of Oahu, and asked for data related to school-based arrests. So now we have a second source of data that shows when a child was arrested at a school site. And this is new data, never before published. I had actually, as part of my work at the ACLU, I was a legal fellow, I requested this data from HPD and some of the other counties, and they had to build this database before this. So HPD looks at rates, has arrest records. When they make an arrest, they look at the address of where the person was arrested. So prior to this, HPD had never built out a database that said which school and then which street address. So they had to build that for me when I was at the ACLU. And I was working on suspension work then, but was happy to continue this work, even though I'm at a different legal organization with these researchers from University of Hawaii. So we looked at comparing the CRDC data and the HPD data to see, are there disparities in who is being arrested at Hawaii schools? So we know that students with disabilities are disproportionately arrested. We know that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students have been disproportionately arrested. And there are some issues with the data. We intended this to be a starting point for further research. We're going to hopefully push out a longer report, including the other counties, not just Oahu, and hopefully push for some policy changes, because this is schools for learning, not for sending kids down to the school prison pipeline and going through the trauma of an arrest, or leading to higher incidence of dropouts or teenage pregnancy. Or this is not how you address student misbehavior in schools.
I completely applaud you in your efforts because what you're doing is creating that systemic change. It maybe that data point is the starting point, you know, and it's
Mhm.
important that it starts. And the one of the interesting points in the report that really stuck out to me as a teacher out here on the neighbor islands was that mention of the inconsistency in data tracking within our Department of Education.
Mhm.
I think that that is something that really would resonate with a lot of people. And it's hard. It's
Yeah,
hard to keep good data. And if we don't have good data, it could be really detrimental to students and their futures. So I just thank you for
exactly.
starting that. I think that's systemic change.
You hit it right on the head. There's a story there. While I was at the ACLU, I was doing data requests for stuff like this, like how many Native Hawaiian children at X school are suspended each year. Um, DOE rejected those requests. They said, we don't keep track of disparities in suspensions. So we can't give you that data. So the state law, the state sunshine law, doesn't require that you give somebody data if that's not data that you keep, right? I mean, that makes sense. It's like, okay. But the thing is that's really detrimental to community members, to teachers, to parents. It's the Uniform Information Practices Act here in Hawaii. So I think every state in the federal government has an equivalent. So I was digging into this and I looked at CRDC data, and one of the 15-16 CRDC year uh, was super, like the rates of suspension were so high. Like Hawaii had some of the highest rates of suspension and the longest suspension term length. So not only did the numbers of suspensions far outpace many other districts, but the length of each suspension did. And so we had an event in 2019 that looked at rates of disparities in school suspensions. Because the ACLU had received an intake for a kid getting suspended for 92 days just for smelling like cannabis, not even having it on them, which is a huge due process issue, is a huge issue just in terms of what I would consider to be your right to an education, but has not yet been tested in the Hawaii state constitution. So when I was looking into this, the DOE actually came out after our event and said, oh, just kidding. We messed up the data for that year. So here's our reissue data. And they gave us these like printed out spreadsheets, but never followed up with any actual, even though I asked multiple times for the actual like data files afterwards. And so I kept digging, and in the 15-16 school year, they said that there were no instances of restraint or seclusion. So restraint is anytime you are either mechanically, like handcuff, zip tie, or physically, like holding a child, or chemically, like medicating a child, restraining them. Typically, that happens to students with disabilities, and it is rife for abuse, right? Like here on the mainland, it's just anytime you're holding a kid down who is potentially a danger to him or herself, or like other students or faculty. I understand why it happens, but the data is so crucial there to make sure that the practice is not being abused or harmful to children. Seclusion was outlawed in 2006 here under state law. That's separating a child and putting them by themselves in a room, right? So that is really, can be really traumatic, and that's why under state law you aren't, it's why DOE is not supposed to use that practice. But I had submitted a public records request for all instances of restraint and seclusion, because I was like, fine, I'm gonna ask for something that I know you have to report. So I got these like blacked out, redacted sheets back. So it said the name of the school, the number of kids that, or it didn't even say the number. It was just black bar. But my assumption is that it was either, so here's the thing, it said either 0 or it had a black bar. They should have blacked out the zeros, honestly, because I was like, okay, each black bar is at least one child who was restrained or secluded, restrained most likely in the 15-16 school year. I was like, okay, how can there be It was actually the 16-17 school year, and 17-18, I think. So it was like a little bit off. The years didn't match up CRDC data years. But I was like, how could you go from 0 in 15-16 to having at least like 50 or 60, because I counted all the black bars, like at least 50 or 60 in the following school year. I was like, that can't have, like, how will you have 0? And here's the thing, Hawaii is one of the largest 20 districts in the country. So when it submits data to the US Federal Department of Education, and you submit something like 0, right, when you have so many students, there's a little pop-up that says, did you really mean 0? So someone had to click that. There's like at least 3 layers of like, are you sure? Because you got a lot of kids. Are you sure you meant 0? And so a human had to be like, yes, yes, yes. So a U.S. Government Accountability Office (GAO) report came out about the use of suspension, like restraint seclusion, and it reported these things. And Hawaii was on there as like being flagged as having data reporting issues. And I was like, I already like requested this data. I was like running around, so I reported to Civil B and Star Ad. I was like, look, how do you have this huge school district? We're 1/3 the size of LAUSD, LA Unified School District. Like, if we can get our data reporting together, like every school district has to do this. This is not like a big ask, right? Like, tell me, like, an accurate number of kids. Like, how do you not know how many kids in your school got suspended? And like, how do you double count that, right? It's very basic. So previously, there was no data reporting policy mechanism. There's no like check. It was a school would send it to the complex area superintendent, and then they would roll it up to the main district. And here's the thing, we reported 0 school psychologists in the 15-16 CRDC data. And then we had at least like 14 or more, but we said 0. And the reason was they're staffed at the complex area level. They're not staffed at the school level. So when the data got rolled up, no one was like, hey, we didn't get any school psychologists. There's no central office. There's like one guy. I've talked to the one guy. There's one guy who does the data. He's like, it's like he puts it in, but he's not in charge of the accountability. That's not his job, right? Like, I have a lot of sympathy for him. Like, he just gets like, he just has to like roll up what they give him. And so all of that together really sort of lit the way of like, how do we even push for a policy change? And we know there are issues here if we don't even have the good data. So when I was at the ACLU, we drafted 2 bills, one to cap the length and suspensions. There are like at least, I want to say roughly like 30 or so states that have like capped or in some ways limited school suspensions. And then we also add a data transparency bill that would have required the Hawaii Department of Education to accurately collect and report data, but also do the analysis I mentioned earlier to look at whether there are disparities in their data for different groups of underserved students. So we drafted these 2 bills, lobbying for these bills. Then COVID happened, and then the legislature shut down. And so in a special post-COVID session, the data bill stayed active and actually passed into law last year. It's now Act 067. If you want to look it up and look at the text of the bill, you can look at the Hawaii Capitol website. It's SB 2486. And so I'm really excited and looking forward to seeing the results of that, because it requires the DOE to make that analysis, but also make it public in an easy to understand way. Because it's not just about having that data, it's just making sure it's accessible for community members and teachers and parents